I would like to thank Brandon Hamber, who's the Hugh O'Neill Chair in Peace at Ulster University, for making this facility here, the video suite, in the Belfast campus of Ulster University available, and to being the technical guy here, the guy that we blame if anything goes wrong. So thank you, Brandon, and also thanks in advance, because after Ramin has spoken, Clem McCartney will be giving a short response before we open it to the floor. So everybody's very welcome, and I say that hopefully there will be more people joining us in a while. And we're really delighted to have Ramin Jahan Beglouf with us here this evening to talk about nonviolence and democracy building. And obviously, in various contexts, democracy is how shall we say, an endangered species. So we look forward very much to hearing his thoughts. Then Clem a few responses, and it will be open to you, the participants, to contribute and ask questions or make comments. But please do use the chat facility as we go along. So over to then and his talk on.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Brandon. And I say hello to everyone, and especially to those of you who will see this program much later, maybe in a few days, few months' time. I was asked to talk about nonviolence and democracy building, so I think that it was better and more appropriate to start from the current news in relation with the crisis of democracy. And I thought that it would be nice to talk about, start with the election of Donald Trump, because I think that election of Donald Trump for a second term as the president of the United States and the rise of the far-right parties in the EU parliamentary elections, they represent a turning point in the life of the liberal democracies. This is how we tend to think of democracy dying, but this time not at the hands of men with guns and tanks, but at the hands of elected leaders. The classical coup d'etat that we have seen in the 1970s in Latin America or elsewhere, the death of democracy was immediate. As I said, it was with soldiers, with tanks. But on the electoral road that we have seen in Europe and United States, there are no tanks in the streets. And an essential test for our democracies today is not why such figures as Donald Trump emerge, but why the democratic liberal parties do not prevent them from emerging and gaining power in the first place. So that is a real question, actually, again, going back to the question of citizens and civic virtue and the role of citizens in providing space for democracy and democratic life, and in the opposite, those who prefer to be complacent and conformist as citizens. Maybe that is why we can speak of several challenges which concern democracy and democratic life, and I will talk about them. The first challenge, I think, is the erosion of democratic norms. We know by fact that democratic institutions are easily swept away. It's unlike the difference between a tyranny or a dictatorship and a democracy. And this means that constitutional safeguards are no more enough to secure a democracy. But secondly, there is a greater challenge to the life of democracy, and this challenge is the absence of democratic passion. Again, I want to quote one of my favorite philosophers. I've been quoting him in Ireland already 2 times. That's Spinoza, the Dutch Jewish philosopher, who wrote actually that without passion, no human activity can prosper. And the argument, I think, is a sound one because when we apply it to contemporary politics and especially democracy, we see that democracy cannot survive without democratic passion of the citizens. It is a fact democratic citizens in many liberal democratic countries have given up on democratic passion by replacing it with blind obedience of populism. We have it in Hungary, we see it in Austria, we see it in many elections, we see it with Orban and many others in different countries. And if we take the example of Europe, we see that with the fall of the Berlin Wall, actually, liberal democracy triumphed against the old standard systems of governance at the time. Everybody was very happy about that, up to a point that you had Francis Fukuyama, who talked about the end of history. Uh, but the fact is that liberal democracy's political ascendancy in Europe has not always been accompanied with the ascendancy of democratic passion. Today, I think a democratic man of Europe is no longer an animal of political passion, if I can say it this way. Uh, and I go back to my Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, actually, who analyzed this democratic crowd psychology brilliantly in his work, Democracy in America, in 1835. And he wrote, I quote him, "It is vain to summon a people who have been rendered so dependent on the central power to choose from time to time representatives of that power." So his argument, Tocqueville's argument, implies a wider problem of freedom as self-questioning, self-invention, and self-determination. So if we go back to the European elections, what do we learn from the elections in Europe? Well, they mainly show us that young generations have no memory of Nazism, they have no memory of Stalinism, they have no memory of the two world wars, and they are increasingly becoming apathetic to democracy and democratic life. On the other hand, we have the dictum of John Dewey, which maybe you have heard of him or read him, uh, who used to say that politics is the shadow of big business. So he was always when he wrote in the 1920s, 1930s, he was very afraid that American politics will be in the shadow of big business. And actually, it became in the shadow of big business. So if I take all these issues, I think that we're left asking the question, is liberal democracy as a discourse and as an institution in need of a moral leadership rather than only a political expediency? Because it comes to my mind that when we look at the European elections, we look at the American elections, is always they're talking about political expediency. Somebody like Kamala Harris, for example, represented a political expediency, and she didn't represent any civic virtue or morality or anything in opposition to Trump. But it was actually for them beating Trump or winning against Trump was actually a political expediency for the Democrats. So this is how we can relate here nonviolence and democracy building. Today, I think all around the world, elections show us a lack of moral leadership among the politicians and the political parties. I challenge you to show me only one leader around Europe, one leader among all the leaders who can be also a moral leader. So here, once again, we are confronted with different techniques of party organizing and power shifting rather than with what we can call the art of ethically organizing the society. Uh, I stay with Europe because I think Europe is important. Europe as a political entity has a long tradition of civic virtue and ethical citizenship, starting with Socrates and ending with writers, intellectuals like Émile Zola and Albert Camus. Socrates, I think we can say that he taught us that questioning is essential in politics. And that's why he was put on trial and he had to drink the poison and die. He had a dialogical approach, which shows us today that living a life of excellence is transformative, underpinning shared responsibility. So I will underline all these concepts that I'm throwing to you because these are very key concepts when we're talking about democracy. Shared responsibility, shared sovereignty, excellence, moral excellence, being transformative. And I follow, I follow Socrates in his shoes because when he says that excellence breeds excellence, I really believe in that. As an educator, as somebody who teaches young people at universities, and I've been teaching them for long periods of time, I really believe that if educators they believe in their excellence and they believe in moral excellence, they can transmit it to the younger generation. But unfortunately, it's like our universities, especially in United States and North America, are catastrophes. They have become, I would say, engines of endowment and money making rather than anything else. If we go back to our Greeks, the supreme task for them was to discover and achieve human excellence, a process they called paideia, which enriched the human ideal. Again, for somebody like Socrates, excellence was about values, it was about ideals, it was about character building rather than expertise. Nowadays, in our universities, we have only experts. And what they teach to the younger generation is not ethics, and it's not democratic politics, is expertise actually. Uh, So they become like plumbers, actually, I would say. All these kids which are get out of universities around the world, they're like plumbers. They know, but outside plumbing, they don't know what to do with life, with the elemental life. So therefore, Europe's idea of excellence evolved with its vision of the Socratic mind. And Europe, at every level of its civilizational evolution, learned to live a life which is a mode of moral choices. And this was closely related to a process of political questioning, which was also a learning process, what the Germans actually called, and they continue to call, Bildung. Bildung, while being a formative movement of intellectual incubation, uh, being a more mental, we can call it a mental growth. Actually, Immanuel Kant, one of the philosophers of the 18th century, he called it mental growth. But it was also civic education, uh, and at the same time was a process of political questioning within modern society. However, European philosophy has taught us that political questioning must be undertaken with scrupulous moral concern, relying on civic virtue. And this is where civic virtue becomes so important. Now, some of you might ask me, why do you repeat so much civic virtue? Civic virtue, I mean, if you go back and read about the American Revolution, you see that most of the characters who made the American Revolution and after that up to the Federalists, they are all always talking about civic virtue. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton. One of the key concepts which comes in their writings is civic virtue. It's not winning the elections. It's not just fighting but it's also civic virtue. Civic virtue is necessary for creating a political community. And Ireland is a good place to talk about political community. In other words, we cannot build a democratic community without a morally enhanced self-examination and self-transformation. Let us not forget that one of the pillars of nonviolent democratic theory, what I call nonviolent democratic theory, is the idea of resistance against unjust laws and struggle against the failure of democratic virtue. Okay? And here, actually, I get to Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi's idea of resistance exemplifies what I said, and it advocates the right to be loyal or disloyal to the institutions, or disloyal, you know. As much as loyalty is important, disloyalty is also very important. Because he said there is no halfway house between active loyalty and active disloyalty. So if we take this as a very important aspect of our thinking, political thinking and democratic thinking, in these days where we are living a democratic crisis or crisis of democracy, resistance is made possible by an ethical voice. And it's made possible by an implicit questioning of the social and political institutions. And that's why Gandhi talked about, when he was talking about the philosophy of nonviolent resistance, he talked about Swaraj, uh, which he said Swaraj is kind of being enlightened, self-rule, self-realization, and very close to the idea of Socratic political questioning, actually. So consequently, the element which links Socrates and Gandhi to somebody like Emile Zola, a Dreyfusard intellectual, is the mode of approach to truth and justice and resistance against all forms of fanaticism. I would say it's the same struggle. If we have to fight against fanaticism, we have to fight for democracy, but at the same time, we have to fight for justice and we have to fight for truth. Many intellectuals in 18th and 19th century, they knew that. Many philosophers knew that, and they wrote about it. So this restless struggle against fanaticism is the basic idea of Europe, if I can say it. Okay, the basic idea of Europe. Now, I'm not the first one who's mentioning this in this way, actually saying the idea of Europe. One of the people that I admired a lot, and he passed away 2 years ago, George Steiner, I did a book with him. He has a book which is called Idea of Europe. But of course, he's not doing it like me because he's not a political philosopher. I'm a political philosopher. He wrote it through, language, literature, poetry, and other things. But the idea of Europe is important. I mean, to put it in this, but by this formulation, I think is very important. It's this restless struggle against fanaticism is the basic idea of Europe that you can find also in the philosophers of the Enlightenment, especially Voltaire. It amounts to claiming, like Albert Camus, that it is important that we hold tight to the moral compass in order to resist all forms of fanaticism and violence. So today around the world, but especially in liberal Europe, the practice of nonviolent democratic theory against forces of populism and exclusion is certainly one of the great features of moral and political leadership. Okay, and I think moral leadership is as important as political leadership because we don't talk about it, especially when at the time of elections, everybody's talking only about political leadership. And I think we should understand that democracy cannot function in Europe and in the US without respect for social decency and individual dignity. And this is what distinguishes democracy from populism. democracy is an art of giving dignity to the people and creating a decent society. However, populism, with its murderous arbitrariness and its deadly meaninglessness, I would say, takes these values away. That is why being a loudmouth populist in Europe or America is not necessarily a sign of political maturity and excellence. On the contrary, modernity replaces violence and fear with dialogue and understanding. And I think when we delve into ethical content of politics, this could be a great lesson of nonviolence. So you see, I'm bringing all the concepts with which I'm thinking about democracy building and how democracy is important and how either we have to preserve it or we have to make it or remake it, let's say, if we have lost it. And I think that for a long period of time, from Socrates to Camus, many intellectuals, thinkers, artists in the European continent, actually, they have fought for this and they have fought and fought with THOUGHT and fought actually FOU, fought, struggled for it. So these are all very, very important aspects. Now, I'm not going to be very long on what I want to say, but I think that there are a few points to talk about. So the essence of my talk was to say that we have to understand that democracy is very frail and fragile. And as something which is fragile, demands our responsibility. You know, a baby is fragile and asks for our attention and asks for our responsibility. Democracy is like a baby, you know. It asks for citizen attention and it asks for citizens to be responsible towards it. So it's very important to think in these terms, I would say, when we're talking about democracy. So the real question today would be, who is afraid of democracy? Who is afraid of democracy? Let me put it this way. And the answer would be the same as it was at the time of the trial of Socrates in Athens. Why did they put Socrates on trial? Because they were afraid of Socrates, because he was against sophism, he was against the sophists, he was against lying, he was against political expediency, he was for self-examination, and he was for justice and many other things. So all these aspects are, I think, very, very important to take into consideration when we're talking today about democracy and democracy being in danger. So as a result, every process of thinking consciously and courageously with the heritage of nonviolence, I think could help Europe and America in general, and I would say Northern Ireland in particular, to pave the way to the construction of a new political era, which will overcome separation between politics and ethics, and to overcome the gap between democracy and nonviolence. I don't see a gap between nonviolence and democracy, and I think this is important to accept and to understand. So I think that the answer to the creeping crisis of politics and especially democracy is not a retreat to our virtue of selfishness, which we're doing. It's not a retreat to individualism, but it could be a call to disobey, civil disobedience, knowing how, where, and how to disobey. Okay? Because I think that civil disobedience or disobedience in general is constructing a space for freedom. When we disobey unjust laws, we are actually trying to construct a space for freedom. Because it determines the individual and the public in a polity, preserving a political community as a dynamic res publica, meaning public space, actually, and it's very, very important. I think that in general, disobedience and the morality, the morality of disobeying or ethics of disobeying is very important, is important as the ethics of dissent. They go hand in hand because they are both a hallmark of free questioning. And without this free questioning, I think that there cannot be any democracy. So to end, I would just add, let us remember, I go and back and take one of the my heroes in nonviolence, which is Martin Luther King Jr. And the speech that Martin Luther King gave in 1955 at Holt Street Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, when he was starting his campaign against segregation in America. And he said, we are here because of our love for democracy, because of our deepest seated belief that democracy transformed. Listen carefully. Democracy transformed from thin paper to thick action is the greatest form of government on earth. So in this paragraph, which I read, or in this sentence, long sentence, there are two key words: thick action and thin paper. Okay? Thick action is the action of the citizens, is the action of those who have the passion of democracy. Thin paper is actually has to do with legality. It has to do with lawmaking. It has to do with political expediency. You know, it's the difference between Henry David Thoreau and somebody who's sitting in Capitol in Washington. That's the difference that King is actually referring to. And so I think that here we have a radical legacy of King, which remains primarily an answer to the violence in our common world and gives us a chance to fight this violence morally, ethically, politically. And let me just end by saying that violence is never finished, only abandoned, as we can see it today in Ireland also, in Northern Ireland. But when violence comes back to human history, it is a signal that we need to set sail once again towards nonviolence. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ramin, for your very considerable thoughts on this matter. Before we open it up to to participants in general, I'm going to ask now Clem to come in with his response as a make a short response to what Ramin has shared. Clem.
Okay, so thank you, Ramin, for those introductory remarks, or maybe more than introductory remarks, substantial remarks. And thank you for hosting this, Rob. It's timely, in a sense, to be talking so much about democracy in the context of the Year of Democracies, and particularly in Ireland in the day before we have an election, where there is some of the same issues arising, though perhaps not as markedly as you have described in some other parts of the world, but perhaps that's only a question of time. And some of the other people on the call tonight may in fact have some comments to make on these kind of issues in relation to the election that we're having at the moment. And I know, Ramin, that you would be very interested to get some take on what's happening here. So the current moment is very important. And your contribution, I think, your input has kind of really highlighted the complexity of the forces and elements at play in whether we have a functioning and operating democracy or not. And in particular, I think for the present audience, how far nonviolence can contribute to a more positive outcome from that complex interplay. I was very struck when you were talking that the issues you're raising about democracy are issues which have existed in human existence. The tension between the people and the leaders and the rulers, and who is in fact sovereign. We started out with tribal systems. We had then sovereign rulers. We had theocracies. We had capitalism, economic authority. We had the dictatorship of the proletariat. And now we've got democracy. And none of those up until now has really worked for the ordinary people. They have been subverted and captured by vested interests at different times in different places. And democracy is the latest seat of this struggle, if you like. And it's not at all clear that it's going to come out well in the end. I think you've made that point. But you've given some ideas as to what are the things which need to happen in order to reach an effective solution. And you've mentioned in passing nonviolence and that. I have a feeling you could say more about that. And you certainly this afternoon said you give a lecture and you talked about empowerment and nonviolence, which I think both of those concepts you decided not to touch so deeply on tonight, but they are very relevant to what you were saying. And I think your comment about fear is quite an important one, because in this restless struggle that you talk about, it's a fear of giving authority to the people, that they may interfere with what you want. They're a nuisance and an interference. And so how can we overcome that? And you mentioned quite a few things, but I was thinking about these kind of classic ideas about what are the basic requirements of democracy. And some of those we do have. We have regular elections. We have, in some places, free and fair elections, and so on and so forth. But I think the one that we don't have, that I think resonates with what you're talking about, is a free and informed electorate. That people really know what they're thinking about when they enter an election. And why has that happened? And that is the disempowerment that has been happening. And the word you used earlier today, statelessness, that people feel. They don't really know, and they don't really want to know, in many cases, the issues and the concerns of the issues. They would prefer, in some ways, to be told what to do, and that's the appeal of the populist. And so it very much suits, I think, a lot of elements, a lot of interest in society, that the people are somewhat kept in the dark. The one theory of democracy that you may not have heard of, because it's, I think, called the Irish theory, and that's the mushroom theory of democracy. You put the people in the dark and you throw muck over them. And a way that comes to my mind when we're talking here. And I'd like to finish with just one little story. I remember when we were having the trouble in Ireland, more directly and severely than we have today, people from the US used to come and help us to think about how we could run a democratic system better. And they were promoting focus groups and polling and trying to work out what would appeal to the electorate. And they told our politicians, tailor your message to what the people want. And our politicians couldn't understand this at all. And I can be very withering about our politicians at times. But their view was, we know what we want to offer the people. We want to know how to convince them of what they want. So there's a kind of an honesty about that. It wasn't tailoring your message to the people and then forget about what the people want afterwards. It was actually challenging the people and saying, this is what we think we want to do for you. Are you willing to go along with this, or do you prefer to go along with someone else? So I think a lot of it does come back to the tendency in the modern restless struggle to keep the people from really thinking and discouraging them from acting, being empowered, and feeling they do have a stake and that stake can be achieved. And I think that is some of the things that I hope well, maybe in the next half an hour or so we might explore a bit further.
Okay, thank you, Clem, for these points, which are very correct and actually summarizes what I wanted to say. But I mean, your reflections actually helps me to add to what I wanted to say. There are a few points that I need to make here. One of the points is that a democratic society is not a religious society. Not when we are talking about democracy, we do not organize a democracy like a religious community. Okay? It means that uh, democratic laws are made by the people, they are not made by God. So they can be changed by the same humans, you know? That's very important. Having this uh, the will of changing laws and being able to disobey political laws and change them, I think this is one of the elements, very important elements, uh, democracy, which I think we should talk about it. So if we get to a point that democratic societies become tyrannical and they say, no, there's no way that you can change laws and, or you should not change laws, that would be that's where the danger comes. Actually, that's where fanaticism, and we can see it also very clearly in religious societies. You know, take a society like Islamic Republic of Iran, Taliban, Saudi Arabia, and some other societies which do not have any possibility to become democratic, and they don't want to become democratic. You know, uh, so the people are totally absent from the, I would say, the public sphere where the democracy takes shape, and that's very very important. Second point in relation to that, if we accept that democracy is a society of autonomy and autonomous people who can think by themselves and create laws by themselves, but at the same time they can change laws and they can change their leaders. Very important aspect to that, which is we call it understanding and reflection, which means people can understand the reality that they are in the making and they can reflect on it, which is also very, very important. You talked about, Clem talked about thinking. Thinking, I think, is very important. I said it's a very important element, which actually somebody like Hannah Arendt talks about, or Kant talks about. Without thinking, there cannot be any democracy. Now, in today's Europe and in today's America and many other places actually around the world, what we are seeing is that there is a kind of an eclipse of citizens, reflective citizens, and citizens who can think about many things. And at the same time, you have a political leadership who's taking all the questions in hand and trying to say, I'm the only one who can answer it. You know, it's kind of a idiotic arrogance, I would say, that you can find in some leaders like Orban, or you can find it with this, with even in Italy today, or you can find it in Austria, or you can find it with the far rights in Spain and Germany and France, you know. Uh, and the interesting point is, I think that I hope that some of you point out also, and also take it after me and try to give your own point of view. It's interesting that for these political parties, for these men and women in Europe and in the United States and in other places, people don't count at all. What counts is actually masses and mobs. So they are more for mobocracy than democracy, because mobs are, as we saw it in fascism, Stalinism, Nazism, and many other ideologies around the world, mobs actually are obedient. Mobs are people who do not participate in lawmaking, but they participate in destruction, like the Trump mob that we saw destroying the Capitol, you know. So they don't get engaged in a game of reflection, in a game of thinking and creating at the same time, because democracy is thinking and creating at the same time. So I think these are all the points that I wanted to make.
Okay, thank you again, Ramin. If people would like to indicate a raised hand, or if they have a question or a comment they wish to make, and also please continue to use the chat facility. One of the comments there, Ramin, from Mark, was that maybe the democratic ideal of international and humanitarian law can be used to counter rogue states. That's a certain amount on the international aspect of it, but talking at a macro level in terms of democracies and autocracies, would you care to comment on that? I mean,
yes, it is. It's so evident. I mean, it's so evident that international law is not working at all. Actually, I was listening to the news today, and they were on France 24, which I listen to and watch every day. They were interviewing the French foreign minister on what the International Court of Justice just passed on Netanyahu and his Minister of Defense, ex-Minister of Defense. And the French Minister of Foreign Minister, he was saying, but there are some leaders that we have to look at the law, and there are some leaders that you cannot arrest. And the journalist was surprised. He said, well, either you are for the International Court of Justice and international law, or you're against it. And how is it that some people, well, he said, I mean, this is what Netanyahu said also. He said, because Israel is not part of the International Court of Justice. Well, many others who were, like Milosevic and others who were arrested and taken to the International Court of Justice, Red Khmers of Cambodia also, they were not part of the International Court of Justice. So it's kind of a very sophisticated way of, dismissing institutions which took time for humanity to build up, because we wanted to have, I would say, we want to have a place where justice and law and the work of citizens and other things make sense. So, in one word, I think one of the dangers with populism, and one of the dangers that is actually growing up, is growing immensely, is meaninglessness of everything that we have fought for. Meaninglessness of centuries of effort, struggle for secularism, for rights of women, rights of children, rights of ethnic groups, rights of homosexuals, LGBTQ, and many other rights. But I think that if we don't have the backbone, the democratic backbone to defend it, and we are only in the hands of some technologists like Elon Musk or somebody like Donald Trump, I don't know what kind of world our grandchildren are going to live in. Frankly, I'm not sure about that.
Okay. There's a question which or a comment on a question which I want to make, but I'm just looking to see whether people are trying to get in here. Anybody wanting to raise their hand or physically raise their hand, please do. Was that Sean Sean, English, if we...
Thanks, Rob. Thank you very much for organising such an interesting and stimulating seminar. Just one issue I wanted to come back to early in the talk was about the present generation. We're kind of 2-3 generations in Europe away from a major war. Is that a problem, or we're 2 or 3 generations into wealth? The present generation has a different perspective on what democracy should be, of the sacredness of democracy. And just one example here, the area we're here, we returned 4 MEPs a few months ago. There's about a little over 500,000 people. One was a former Rose of Tralee, who was a kind of a beauty queen. One was a former jockey. One was a former TV personality. So that's democracy. That was democracy in Ireland, and there was no interference. Like, there was no, except the media, of course. But I mean, I'm ashamed of the democracy here, even though it's an open democracy and we have access to a lot of information. But I'm not sure whether it's a 3rd generation psychic that we're in at the moment, and we can't appreciate the value of democracy. That's just what came across. Thanks.
Well, this is a very good question, and this question is actually 2 questions at the same time, because one part of it has to do with young people and younger generation, and the other part has to do with how people can sell themselves as artists, intellectuals, anything, to political parties and become members of these political parties and eventually represent them in different parliaments, either in European Parliament or at the national parliaments, or even in America, being present in their different places. So this is very, very important because once again, I think that democracy is today dominated very forcefully by several things. It's first of all by billionaires. It's the first time in the history of democracy that democracy can be bought in this way. We have had rich people participating in democracy, but they could not buy it and they could not actually manipulate it as much as they can. Now, and the second one is that also you have people who do not believe in the spirit of democracy, but they talk about democracy, and they once again, they represent themselves in these political parties or by some characters like Donald Trump, for example. All the people who are now, we know that could have worked with him when he gets to the White House. These are all completely meaningless people, actually. They have no precedence, intellectual precedence for the jobs that they're supposed to do, as a Secretary of State, as a Foreign Secretary, and many other things. None. And I'm really flabbergasted by the fact that you have technologists nowadays that are billionaires, and they get in this forum and they say, well, if we give you millions of dollars, you can give us a job and we can also decide on things that they don't know at all. I mean, politics is a serious matter. The Romans knew that quite well. I mean, when you read Cicero, they took it seriously. I mean, it's a serious matter. Republic is a serious matter. Machiavelli knew that. Everybody else. You cannot play with democracy and you say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. That's the work of narco-traffics, like Pablo Escobar making a zoo in Colombia. Okay, we understand even the drug dealers, but we don't understand it when it becomes, it pretends to be a democratic game. And actually, it's not a democratic game. It's destroying. And the worst part is how it educates. It deforms the democratic education for the younger generation who are coming after. Because with everything else which has happened in the past 50 years in our societies, these young people, they would say, well, if he can do it, if Elon Musk can do it, I can do it. And I will take, instead of taking the Socratic way, instead of taking the way of justice, of disobedience, of dissent, of learning, of being a Democrat, I'm going to take the way of Wall Street. I'm going to take the way of Silicon Valley. And so this is, I think, this is one of the big dangers that we have. How can we, as educators in different universities, or even at the level of high schools, teach democracy to teenagers and later on to those who are in their 20s and 30s without really having this backbone? And especially because academia is not protecting us anymore. You know, academia is all about money. Everywhere around the world has become about money. Even in India, where I teach, has become about money. So students, they don't believe in it. All of them, they want to do business school and become corporate lawyers because there's money in it. So I tell my students, I say, if everybody becomes a corporate lawyer, who's going to be a criminal lawyer and who's going to be a human rights lawyer? We need human rights lawyers. No, but they're not interested in being a human rights lawyer. So I think the way that the democracy and democracy building is identified through these characters which are completely immoral and unethical is very dangerous for the future of democracy.
Okay, thank you, Sean and Rena. I would like to actually make a comment there, extending what has been said in relation to one aspect of politics in the Republic, which concerns the triple lock and the various peace activists and so on have been trying to raise that as an issue in the election. But what we have there is a kind of alliance of the conservative political parties, the media, and other establishment figures, including some in the army, who want to move away from Irish neutrality, which is popular among the people, and it was, if you like, it wasn't copper fastened in relation to the EU Lisbon on these treaties, but to get those treaties agreed in Ireland when people were saying no, the state and the government then said there will only be deployment of Irish troops overseas when it is agreed by the Dáil Parliament, by the government and by the UN. And there has been a very significant move by the establishment to get rid of the UN part of that triple lock. And it just, to me, it beggars belief that there is this kind of, hesitate to use the word conspiracy, but it's it may be a passive conspiracy, if you like, to avoid the questions which are there and to avoid giving the people what they actually want in relation to neutrality, which is to support it. So that's a very current issue, and trying to get those kind of issues raised is extremely difficult. So it's another aspect of the democratic system and its current deficiencies in the situation here. Looking kind of at the comments, I don't know what some people have said that the sound is kind of coming and going. I don't know what I wasn't paying attention to the comments. If you're not able to bring those back down. Civic responsibility is a subject which is absent. Somebody made that comment. Would they like to comment on that? I can't see who it was.
It was Christine and Stephanie both.
Okay. Did you want to comment on that?
I can come on.
Yeah.
No, it was not absent in what I said because I talked about civic virtue, and when you talk about civic virtue, responsibility comes with it, actually. I mean, it's all about responsibility. And I did talk about the frailty of democracy, and I said that when something is frail, and I send you to Hans Jonas and his book on responsibility, the principle of responsibility is we are responsible towards things which become frail and weak and fragile. So I think that this fragility has always been there for democracy. I mean, people in 19th century they knew that. I mean, John Stuart Mill is somebody who already knew that when he's talking about liberalism and liberal democracy, there are many dangers around, uh, and we have to be very careful with that. But we have. We have some hidden enemy. I mean, democracy has some hidden enemies, which are very, very dangerous. And I actually mentioned them because I think that in today's world, with the social media, I think social media has two aspects to it, two faces. Social media can be actually educating and can be a way to educate young people in democracy, but at the same time, it could be also a mode of education for fascism and for populism and for complacency and conformism. So we have to be very careful with that, and that's very, very dangerous. And that's what has been it differentiates us from let's say in 20th century and from 19th century. So that's very, very important. I think that truly with everything which is happening, we see that intellectuals, they were much more active around the European intellectuals. I mean French, Italian, German, Eastern European, uh, Spanish. They were much more active in 20th century in the task of democracy building and protecting democracy, like they did in Spain, for example, against fascism, against the ideologies which were anti-democratic. But today, I don't see that fervence. I don't see that courage. I don't see that presence, intellectual presence or artistic presence as it must be, as much as it must be. Uh, Maybe because the problem number one of practically everyone has become that is to self-celebrate oneself. You know, even when they are fighting for war in Gaza, I mean against war in Gaza, they just want to be seen on the social media and they want to be seen on TV. And this is not what I'm talking about. You know, this is not how we can defend democracy. Actually.
Okay, thank you, Ramin. Other people are wanting to come in, perhaps if you raise your hand physically or um, the symbol. Stefania has shared a link to an event coming up and points out that there's a conference in January to bring together educators to advocate the use of philosophy and critical thinking with young people. Apologies if there are problems with the sound. We're doing our best with the system here. There's one other area which I would like to raise with Ramin, if nobody else is wanting to come in at this stage. We're sitting here in Belfast in Northern Ireland, and the question of democracy is a big one because we now have two equal weighted communities. Well, there are people in the middle or whatever as well. You know, if you go for the 40-20 analysis of who wants what. And it certainly strikes me that in terms of the troubles in Northern Ireland, that set democracy back very considerably because I would certainly believe that the people did not see it, but that there were non-violent possibilities. But clearly, people didn't see those,
early in when the troubles began, and the results of violence were to divide people further. So that division is still very evident, and it is not going to go away in the near future. And if nonviolence is a way, if nonviolence is a way forward, um, then there's the question of how we kind of bring that to bear in relation to the democracy or the system which we have. Now, in a sense, that's putting you, Ramin, in the spot because you have only been here a few days and have only had a chance to talk to some people, but maybe you might like to make one or two comments in relation to that.
Yes, I mean, I'm still. I have to be very frank. I have to be very modest here. I said I'm very happy to come to Northern Ireland. I've already been to Dublin, and to talk to people on loyalist side, Republican side, uh, and many other people, and trying to learn on Northern Ireland. I think that I mean I've talked with Brendan a lot about this, and I think that it's a very complex situation. But from my point of view, because of course I practice nonviolence, I write about nonviolence, I teach nonviolence. I think that Northern Ireland has still a lot to learn from the experience of other people in other parts of the world, where South Africa being one of them, actually, which Brendan represents here, uh, but also India, I would say, or many other places, where mm, both politicians, intellectuals, but also maybe many elements in the different communities. They learned to somehow promote democracy by trying to control violence, I would say. Control violence. I'm not saying that they got rid of it once for all, but by controlling. But in most of these societies, I think there has been a very strong civil society and very strong civic actors, especially civic actors who have been either intellectuals or people who have been organizers, social organizers, and people very present in the public space, where you can have a kind, or you can create forums where people can discuss issues with each other. So spaces of discussion, forums are very important. Uh, and in those forums, in those spaces of discussion, where you can, of course, bring also the teenagers, and you can also bring the young people, and we have to bring them, putting into question, having feeling the freedom which you don't feel. You know, one of the things I have to say, frankly, one of the things that I've seen in my Irish friends is fear. Is fear. The fear is it's not a militant fear, because the militants of either side, they fear each other. They still might fear each other, but there's fear. I mean, there's a public fear. You know, it's a fear of not going to a pub and opening up. It's a fear of not talking about some things and leave it tacit. You know, but this, if there is fear and there is no openness, you can never bring out actually all these psychological problems and solve them, or talking about, or talk about it, or talk about alternatives. And this is very, very important. So we are talking here about education of democracy, or the democratic education. How citizens in Northern Ireland, they can educate themselves and they can educate next generations, you know, not by being indifferent. You know, I've seen this indifference in this university. When I talk to the students, they don't react at all. as if they're coming from Mars and they're not members of the Northern Ireland Society. That's very strange to me. You know, if you go to the Middle East and eventually you go to Iranian society or you go to Afghan society, even Afghanistan, which is one of the worst places in the world, and you talk to young people, they're going to react on this question, and they would say, "No, we are against this, and we are for this, and we are fighting for this or that." You know. Uh, but here I had the feeling that, okay, we are not implicated that much. And this was our fathers, grandfathers, grandmothers, uncles. I don't know. This is not our story, but it is their story. So the narrative is missing somehow. And when we are talking about democracy, we are not just talking about a solid thing outside us, which is a solid reality. We're talking about the narrative also. We're talking about the discourse. We're talking about the social psychology of democracy and how to live in and make democracies or make democracy alive. You know, so all these elements have been present in different periods of human history, and especially in European history. And I think that the element of fear is very important to overcome that. You know, the blacks in America, they overcome their fear, and that's why they succeeded.
Are there people trying to get in here or any other comments that people want to make at this stage? Yes, Sylvia, we'll just unmute you now. Just a second.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's been a fascinating conversation so far. Somebody has already referred to Tralee, but in a slightly perhaps negative tone. I live near Tralee in the southwest of Ireland. And I was struck by Stefania's comment, I'm not sure male or female, that how do we reignite democratic passion? And when you, Ramin, were speaking about, you know, speaking to like a vacuum of students, you didn't say that word, but, you know, there was no response. When I some of the words that you spoke of that I thought were just amazing were like, and I was thinking, could we use this as a yardstick for ourselves and for the people maybe who've been knocking on our doors, looking for votes for tomorrow? People who have democratic passion, people of moral excellence, who want to be transformative, or people who are prepared to take shared responsibility. And I was in a classroom today helping people with English, so there are people from other countries. So I was asking in the warm-up about the election tomorrow and telling them how many seats were coming and trying to explain words like parties. What are parties? And what are seats and what are ballots? And there was one man there, and he's from Georgia, and he would have been an asylum seeker in his time. He's now considered, I suppose, an IPA, international protection applicant. He has all his papers, but he's still living in the hostel because he's never managed to find a place to live. Now there's other issues. So I said, will you vote tomorrow? He said, no. Too complicated. I don't understand any of it. So, and I think it was Clem, maybe you said, you know, is there education for people to become more knowledgeable about civic, or to take civic responsibility? And I suppose I meet a lot of people who really are, the people I meet who have passion are probably the people on the green end of things. And I think that's one of the reasons I like being a bit involved in that movement, because these are people about they're passionate about climate change, and they realize that has to be a shared responsibility. And we all have to play our part. So it isn't that I want you to stop flying I have to stop flying. We all have to stop flying, or we have to work out a way when, to live like using Teams or Zoom instead of having to. So I find in a group of people like that, there is a lot of passion. There's people who are trying to live very moral, excellent lives. I'm sure they wouldn't necessarily say that of themselves. And they very, very much people who are thinking about food sovereignty and thinking about how to live responsibly within the limits of our planet. That's in every area. But I don't find that amongst the general public. I find people are too busy getting on with their own little things, be it shopping on Amazon, or I live in the country, but one of the common things flying down the road is the courier. The courier van is flying down the road, so people are just shopping online and getting on with their ordinary life, and that other stuff has nothing to do with me, really. And sure, what's the point of it anyway? Can't change things. So I just get on watching football and eating hamburgers if I want. So that's the end of my little spiel. But I found it very inspirational. And I thought, ooh, I'd love to be a student in your class, Ramin. Well, I'm in your class tonight. Thank you. You can mute me again. You can mute me again. And thank you, Rob, for letting me come in.
Yeah, and I will relate what Sylvia said to what Stefania has asked, which is about democratic passion and creating thinking spaces for citizens. When passion is a lived experience, we become passionate of something because we experience it, because we practice it. We never become passionate of something that we don't know. We cannot become passionate of in the invisible. We are passionate of things which have visibility. So democracy needs to have visibility. Democracy needs to have transparency. And the only way of giving democracy this transparency, this visibility, is actually spaces for citizens to gather and to talk about democracy. So thinking spaces are certainly very, very important. But we have to be very careful that thinking spaces remain thinking spaces. They will not remain. They will not become spaces or forums of dogmatism, forums of racism, forums of nationalism, forums of fanaticism. This is the danger which has always been like the sword of Damocles on the head of democracy. We should not forget, we go back and read our history. Every time that democracy was destroyed by a totalitarian regime, it was done in this way, actually, by inviting people to come and vote, but at the same time trying to control those people, And this is how Hitler came to power. They didn't use any tanks at the time, actually. I'm not talking about the Munich, but I'm talking about when he became a chancellor. So this is something which is very important. But who are the people who... I don't think that we can let anyone, and Plato and Socrates knew that quite well. We cannot let anyone educate young people. People who can educate are people who are democratic themselves, who believe in democracy themselves. If you let sophistic people educate kids, educate youngsters in politics, you will not necessarily get democracy. Most of these political parties around Europe, they have summer camps. They have summer camps, and they get a lot of juveniles, and they get many young people to come to their summer camps. In Scandinavia, we have that. In Germany, we have. In France, we have that. In Spain, we have that. Okay, but it's important to know, what do they teach them? Do they teach them about democracy, or do they teach them to vote for their political party? These are two different things. So here I think that the work of civic actors and intellectuals has been very important. I think that the role I mentioned it previously today, I think the role of feminists has been very important since the 1960s. Different generations of feminism in Europe has been very, very important for to advance democracy, and democratic rights for women, I would say. Very, very important. But it has also been important for other countries, because if you gain some liberties in Europe and you make these forums of freedom and thinking, others in other places like Middle East or Asia or South Asia or East Asia, they want to follow up. But if you do exactly the opposite, they would say, okay, this is the best way to become a dictator or keep a dictator, like in Azerbaijan, for example.
Thank you, Ramin. We're moving towards 9 o'clock and finishing this very interesting session. I just want to see if there was anybody else who was wanting to come in there before we...
You wanted to say something?
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
yeah, unless there's someone else. No, I wanted to make a comment and then sort of ask a question. The first comment is probably my instinctual desire to want to defend my students when you said they didn't want to comment. But I think you are correct. I think if we talk with them about Black Lives Matter, about climate change, they will engage fully. But if you say to them, let's talk about what happened in Northern Ireland, there is that exact fear. So I think you are correct. But I would actually say that's not a young person's problem. That's everyone's problem in the society. If you sat down with folks here and said, come, let's have a chat about a united Ireland, do you think it's a good idea or not? Do you think violence was good in the past? People would clamor. They would not want to have that discussion. I can count, I've been here more than 20 years, had a discussion about a united Ireland maybe 3 or 4 times. So I think the observation is correct. There's this anxiety about putting yourself out there that somehow you'll be chopped down. And I think people in the peace movement here experienced that. Which side are you on? Or the unions had the same problem. The first is maybe just an observation, say I agree with that idea of fear. I think that is correct. The second is more of a question, because you talked about the idea of sort of introducing or reintroducing or giving birth or letting it come back, the idea of ethics or morality into politics. And I was wondering if you feel that extends to all sorts of institutions. So one of the things I feel when I'm here is if you look at the establishment of the Human Rights Commission, there's no preamble from an ethical perspective which says this is why we needed a Human Rights Commission. Or if you look at the reform of the police, there's not a big long treatise as to why this is why we need to reform the police from an ethical, moral perspective, or to make sure everyone's included. If you look at the discussion about decommissioning of weapons, it was very much, this is a practical, how do we do this? Not a discussion about how did we get here? What's this about? And likewise, because it was one of the first questions when we think of Gaza, to some degree, this is maybe my personal perspective, as much as I'm in favor of the court cases that are happening, it's also been turned into a technical issue rather than a moral and ethical issue. So like, can we technically show on a piece of paper in a court that this is genocide? When, as they like to say in this part of the world, even the dogs in the street know the truth. But we now have to prove the truth. So we've actually taken the ethics and the morality out of it. So I just wanted your reflection on, do you feel that that's a problem along lots of institutions? I certainly do, rather than just the core of the democratic process. And I say that also from the perspective of being anxious about the idea of also reintroducing morality and ethics, because it feels sometimes it moves us a little bit towards church and state type idea, like a sort of moral idea which the church always dominated in the past. I'm not saying we would do it that way. Any reflections on it?
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, when I'm talking about the ethical, I'm not putting myself in the system of right and wrong. You know, I think that this is a debate for a theologian. You know, mostly talking about right and wrong would be. I leave it to church. I leave it to actually religious people who want to emphasize what is right and what is wrong. Uh, Here, ethics in relation with democracy and in relation with nonviolence is more about things that we try to know, understand, and work with or live with, you know, and that's the most important part of it. It's more practical. It's about everyday life, and there is no how can I say there is no we don't bring the idea of hope in it. You know, again, the idea of hope is very eschatological. And here, when we are talking about democracy, the one thing which is absent totally in democracy and democratic thinking and democratic making actually is eschatology and messianism. We are not messiahs and we are not messianic actually. We are not talking about messianic hope. We're talking about something which is we were talking about a social political entity which is in the possibility of human beings to create, and they have done it historically previously with many errors, of course. But there has been the human history shows us is that we also can somehow get beyond our errors and correct our errors in our democratic building, you know. So I think I admire the historian, the European history, because I think the history of Europe actually at every level shows us that there has been an effort, both intellectual, philosophical, but also political. Uh, of course, I mean, we have the American Revolution also, but American Revolution is also, I mean, having somebody like Trump or others is not, or Vance, for example, it's not, uh, I think it's not unimaginable because there has always been this theological element in the American democracy, you know, from the very beginning. Why? Because it was done by the Puritans, unlike the French Revolution. Okay. The element, the French Revolution, I think, is much more important, despite the fact that there was less violence in the American Revolution than in the French Revolution. So we cannot actually accept that violence or say or approve it, somehow legitimize it. But we can understand the fact that the people themselves were very present. So I was putting my finger on how can we have people in different parts of the world being educated, you know, or giving them this chance of educate themselves, you know, educate themselves, because this is about, I mean, the forums, the thinking forums is about how they gain the capacity, autonomous capacity of thinking by themselves, and by thinking by themselves, being able to practice it, you know, and that's real democracy. Of course, this is more of a deliberative democracy, participative democracy, or what we call direct democracy. But anyway, even we might bring in the concept of representation, but yet again, we have to think of those representatives that they really are representatives, and they are not people who go against our will, which is actually the case today. So this element, I think, is very, very important. You were talking about young people. Yes, education of young people, democratic education of young people is something which is very important. But how are we educating them today? How is social media educating them today? I think I see a lot of negative aspects to social media, you know, because anybody can come and say anything. So there is no way that you can enter a real dialogue with people who are fanatics, people who are against democracy, or people who actually might destroy. I mean, a very nice forum, which is a forum for like what we are doing right now, exchange of ideas, trying to understand each other, having new ideas, and eventually get to a product which would be actually work that we can do together. So I think that to conclude, democracy is an act of living together. And this act of living together cannot be based and founded on violence. So one of the elements of these thinking spaces of democracy and acting spaces of democracy is to try to minimize as much as possible and try to tame violence in all its aspects, political violence being one of them, but all aspects. So, I'm talking also about sexual violence, I'm talking about religious violence, I'm talking about intellectual violence, verbal violence, and this has to be done in a very conscious way, a very conscious way. And maybe if we do that, we can succeed.
I think that's an excellent point to end on. I just wanted to acknowledge Diane's point there, asking whether think tanks are a positive or malign influence on democracy. Do you want to say one word on that, or two words? Or
I don't believe in think tanks.
Okay.
Like the ones that you can find in Washington, for example. I don't think that the think tanks all the time, they are really democratic elements, and they're trying really to promote democracy. No, the think tanks, most of the time, they're promoting the government, which pays them to work for them.
I'd like to thank everybody for their contributions. Before I end, I apologize if there was problems about the sound. Our microphones here are actually up in the ceiling. I don't know what the issue or issues were, but apologies if you had difficulty hearing. The thanks obviously go to Ramin and also to Clem for kicking off the conversation. And if this was a face-to-face meeting, I would end it with what I know as a Filipino one clap, which is on the count of three, we do a single clap together. But as we're doing this remotely, timing does not come together. And instead of a Filipino one clap, we have a Filipino several clap. So what I would like to do is people to put their hands together to say thank you to everybody who's been involved in this, and particularly to Ramin for sharing his thoughts. And in I wanted to quote from Barbara Deming, who was a US feminist and peace activist, and I think it's very relevant to the question of democracy, which is where she said, "Nonviolence liberates the oppressor as well as the oppressed." So there's a final thought there in that, and thank you very much, everybody, and particularly to Ramin, also for our technical expert here, Brandon, and good evening to you all, and may the non-violence and the democracy go with you. Good night.
Thank you.